Imagine a concrete rectangle buried in the Colorado mountains, where the United States government spends $127,000 per year, more than Harvard tuition, to systematically destroy human minds while keeping bodies alive. This is ADX Florence, the most expensive prison ever built. A $60 million machine designed by NASA engineers, nuclear security specialists, and submarine architects to break the human spirit through scientific precision. 421 men live here in cells smaller than your parking space, 22.5 hours every day, for decades at a time. No human contact, no sunlight, no hope. Just the slow, methodical erasure of consciousness itself. The government calls it administrative segregation, SAI. International human rights organizations call it systematic torture. The inmates who survive it call it something else entirely. The place where souls go to die while hearts keep beating. Ted Kaczynski is here. El Chapo is here. The most dangerous criminals in America, spending their final years talking to concrete walls because their minds have dissolved under the weight of absolute isolation. But this isn't a story about prisoners. This is about us, about what happens when a democracy decides that some humans are so dangerous they must be psychologically destroyed in the name of public safety, about the $60 million machine we built to manufacture madness and how it infected everyone who touched it. Inmates, guards, doctors, wardens, and ultimately, our national conscience. Today we're opening the classified files on America's most expensive experiment in human destruction. We're going inside the fortress of broken minds, where punishment evolved beyond physical pain into something far more precise and devastating. The systematic erasure of the human spirit. If you're ready to confront the darkest truth about American justice, hit that subscribe button and join us as we uncover what happens when a nation abandons its humanity in pursuit of perfect control. In the heart of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, where Colorado's most beautiful landscape meets its darkest secret, sits a concrete rectangle that costs $60 million to build and destroys human minds for a living. This is ADX Florence, the most expensive prison ever constructed, a facility so classified that its blueprints carry the same security rating as nuclear weapons designs, where 421 men live buried alive 22.5 hours a day in cells smaller than your parking space. Each prisoner costs $127,000 per year to contain, more than Harvard tuition, more than a suburban home's mortgage. We spend more money breaking these men's minds than we do educating our children. But this isn't a story about prisoners. This is about us, about what happens when a democracy decides that some humans are so dangerous they must be psychologically destroyed in the name of public safety, about the $60 million machine we built to manufacture madness and how it infected everyone who touched it. The road to ADX Florence winds through 37 miles of pristine wilderness, past snow-capped peaks that have watched over this valley for millennia. The government chose this location deliberately, remote enough that families must drive 4 hours from Denver just to glimpse their buried sons through bulletproof glass, beautiful enough that the contrast becomes its own form of torture. The facility appears suddenly, like a concrete tumor erupting from paradise, a perfect rectangle of reinforced walls and razor wire, designed to look more like a nuclear research facility than a prison. Because in many ways that's exactly what it is, a laboratory for studying the complete breakdown of human consciousness. The land beneath it tells its own story of American transformation. Originally surveyed in 1987 for a minimum security prison farm where inmates would tend cattle and grow vegetables under the endless Colorado sky. Rehabilitation through honest work, connection to the earth, the old dream of correction through redemption. But by 1993, when construction began, that dream had died. The farm was forgotten. In its place rose something unprecedented in the history of human confinement. From above, the footprint reveals the architectural philosophy. No curves, no gardens, no spaces for gathering. Just a series of concrete boxes within concrete boxes, designed by men who had studied submarine compartments psychiatric hospitals, and nuclear bunkers, who borrowed technology from institutions built to contain radiation and mental illness. 490 cells, 1,400 electronically controlled doors, 47 tons of concrete per human being. The mountains watch in silence, as they have for centuries. But now they watch over something that has never existed before in the American landscape, a place where punishment has evolved beyond physical pain into something far more precise and devastating: the systematic erasure of the human spirit. November 21, 1987. The Atlanta Federal Penitentiary erupts in flames that will burn for 11 days and reshape the American prison system forever. Cuban detainees, held in legal limbo for years, decide they have nothing left to lose. They overwhelm guards with improvised weapons, seize the armory with stolen keys, and transform a federal facility into a battlefield that claims one guard's life and causes $2 million in damage. But the real damage runs deeper than twisted metal and broken concrete. In those 11 days of chaos, federal officials discover a terrifying truth. They have 847 of the most dangerous criminals in America, and nowhere secure enough to hold them. The prisoners they call the worst of the worst are being shuffled between overcrowded state facilities like human hot potatoes. Maximum security isn't maximum enough. Traditional walls and bars, designed for a gentler age of crime, crumble before the organized intelligence of modern criminal minds. The Atlanta riots last 11 days. The response will last forever. Bureau of Prisons. Director J. Michael Quinlan stands in the smoking ruins of Atlanta and makes a declaration that will echo through decades. We will build a facility so secure that escape is not just impossible, it's inconceivable. He doesn't yet understand what he's promising. He doesn't know that he's commissioning the construction of America's first factory for manufacturing psychological destruction, that his words will lead to the creation of something that pushes the boundaries of the Eighth Amendment until they snap. The cost of the Atlanta riots: $2 million in repairs, one guard's life, and the birth of a new philosophy of punishment that will consume billions of dollars and thousands of human souls. The real price is still being calculated, one broken mind at a time. The architects gathered in a windowless conference room in Washington, D.C. in early 1992, faced with an impossible brief: design a prison that can hold the most dangerous criminals in America while technically avoiding the Constitution's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Build a torture chamber that doesn't look like one. Lead architect James Robertson stares at the specifications spread across the conference table. 490 cells, zero possibility of escape. Total isolation without calling it solitary confinement. A facility that must break the most hardened criminals without technically breaking the law. The mathematics of human containment become clinical equations. How many square feet does a human soul require before it dies? How many hours of isolation can the mind endure before it snaps? How do you build walls strong enough to contain hope itself? Robertson's team begins studying institutions never before connected to criminal justice. Psychiatric hospitals where the violently insane are contained behind reinforced glass. Nuclear submarine compartments where men live in sealed environments for months without seeing sunlight. Underground missile silos designed to protect America's nuclear arsenal from enemy attack. They need architecture that thinks like a weapon. The specifications grow more detailed, more disturbing. Cells must be escape-proof, but not technically torture chambers. Isolation must be total, but not officially solitary confinement. Human contact must be eliminated without calling it sensory deprivation. Each cell requires 12-inch reinforced concrete walls, thick enough to stop a car traveling 60 miles per hour, strong enough to contain a nuclear blast, precise enough to contain a human scream. The window design alone costs $47,000 per cell to engineer. A 4-inch slit that shows only a sliver of sky, angled so inmates can never see the horizon. Just enough light to prevent blindness, not enough to maintain sanity. Robertson later admits in a rare interview, "We weren't just building a prison. We were building a machine designed to break people's minds while keeping their bodies alive. We just didn't call it that in the paperwork. Shy. The final blueprints span 47 volumes and are immediately classified at the same security level as nuclear weapons designs. Because the government knows, even then, that they're building something that crosses every moral boundary America has ever acknowledged, something that will require secrecy to survive scrutiny. Summer 1993. The construction crews arrive in Florence, Colorado, like an occupying army. They sign non-disclosure agreements before they see the blueprints, undergo federal background checks typically reserved for CIA contractors, surrender their cell phones at the security gate each morning. Most don't understand what they're building until the concrete walls begin rising from the mountain soil. The project requires 3,400 tons of steel, enough to build a 40-story skyscraper, 47 tons of concrete per cell, enough to construct a suburban home, 1,400 electronically controlled doors that can only be opened from a central command bunker buried 100 yards underground. The construction specifications read like a military invasion plan. Every worker's movement is tracked, every tool is logged and counted, every conversation is monitored. The government is spending $60 million, and they want no witnesses to the process. Local resident Maria Santos lives 2 miles from the construction site and watches the work progress from her kitchen window each morning. It wasn't like building a normal prison, she remembers. The secrecy was oppressive. The workers wouldn't talk to anyone in town. Their faces, they looked haunted. By the 6th month, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Workers quit mid-project, citing nightmares about the cells they're building. Local emergency rooms report a spike in anxiety attacks among construction crew members. The county's suicide rate increases by 23% during the 2-year construction period. The concrete work is particularly disturbing. Each cell requires precision engineering, acoustic dampening to prevent communication between prisoners, pressure-sensitive floors that detect any unusual movement, ventilation systems designed to prevent gas attacks or suicide by suffocation. They're not just building walls, they're building a psychological weapon disguised as architecture. Foreman Robert Chen oversees the cell construction and begins having the same recurring nightmare. Endless concrete corridors filled with human screams that no one can hear. He quits 3 months before the project's completion, leaving behind a resignation letter that reads simply, "I can't build any more boxes for breaking people." The construction is completed in December 1994, 2 months ahead of schedule and $4 million under budget. A rare example of government efficiency that no one celebrates, because by then, everyone involved understands what they've created. A $60 million monument to the discovery that human beings can be systematically destroyed without technically being killed. The mountain soil has been permanently scarred. The pristine valley has been transformed into something unprecedented in the American landscape. A factory for manufacturing madness. December 1994. The final budget calculations arrive at the Bureau of Prisons headquarters like a confession of national sin. $60 million in construction costs, $37 million in annual operating expenses, enough money to fund a small university or provide health care for 20,000 Americans. Instead, they've built a machine that will consume $127,000 per prisoner, per year, for the rest of human memory. The financial forensics reveal the hidden costs buried across 17 different federal departments. Specialized HVAC systems that prevent gas attacks, $4.7 million. Earthquake-resistant foundations for a non-seismic zone, $8.2 million. Communication jamming equipment, $2.3 million annually just to maintain. Each electronically controlled door costs $14,000 to install. Each cell's acoustic dampening system costs $28,000. Each 4-inch window slit costs $47,000 to engineer and install. They've spent enough money to provide full-ride college scholarships for 2,400 students. Instead, they've built 490 concrete tombs for the living. Bureau of Prisons. Director Kathleen Hawk reviews the final numbers in her office, overlooking the Potomac River, the same river that flows past monuments to American ideals like freedom, justice, and human dignity. She understands that ADX Florence represents something different, a monument to the abandonment of those ideals in favor of something more primitive. The desire for perfect control, regardless of cost. Hawk signs the budget authorization, knowing that the facility will never be financially sustainable. The annual operating costs will exceed the GDP of small nations. The hidden expenses, medical care for psychologically shattered inmates, legal fees for constitutional challenges, therapy for traumatized guards, will multiply exponentially over time. But by December 1994, financial sustainability is no longer the goal. ADX Florence has become a symbol, not a solution. A $60 million statement that America is willing to pay any price, abandon any principle, to achieve the illusion of perfect security. Leaked memos from this period reveal the government's true priorities. Cost is irrelevant, writes Deputy Director Francis Ford. We're not building a prison. We're building a monument to absolute control. The mountain winds carry the scent of concrete dust and human ambition across the valley. By January, they will carry something else. The sound of 490 men beginning their descent into systematic psychological destruction. January 10, 1995. The first convoy of prisoners winds through the mountain roads toward ADX Florence under cover of pre-dawn darkness. 100 men, shackled and hooded, riding in armored vehicles designed for transporting nuclear materials. They arrive at America's newest achievement in human containment, a $60 million machine designed to break the human spirit through scientific precision. The intake process unfolds with clinical efficiency. Strip searches conducted in rooms with no windows. Psychological evaluations administered by doctors who will never see these men again. The assignment of numerical designations that replace names, replacing identity with inventory numbers. ADX 001 through ADX 100. The first specimens in America's most expensive experiment in psychological destruction. Warden Robert Hood oversees the processing from a control room lined with monitors showing every angle of the facility. He watches men who have lived by violence and cunning reduced to confused, frightened figures shuffling through concrete corridors in orange jumpsuits and leg chains. Today we begin the most advanced form of human containment ever conceived, Hood announces to his staff. We have achieved something unprecedented in the history of corrections, the complete neutralization of the criminal element through environmental control. He doesn't yet understand what he's unleashing, doesn't know that within 18 months, half of these men will develop symptoms of institutional psychosis, that within 5 years the facility will require a full-time psychiatric ward, that within a decade, ADX Florence will be studied by international human rights organizations as an example of systematic torture disguised as criminal justice. The cells are 7 feet wide by 12 feet long, 84 square feet of floor space, smaller than a standard parking space. Each contains a concrete bed, a concrete desk, a concrete stool, and a toilet that flushes on a 15-minute timer controlled by guards. The 4-inch window slit shows a slice of Colorado sky, but the view is angled so inmates can never see the horizon. Just enough light to prevent blindness. Not enough to maintain hope. 22.5 hours per day in these concrete tombs. 1 hour of recreation in a slightly larger concrete box with a small section of sky visible through wire mesh. 3 showers per week, lasting exactly 7 minutes each. On the first night, recording equipment captures the sound of ADX Florence settling into its rhythm. The mechanical hum of ventilation systems, the electronic clicks of automatic door locks, the whispered conversations of men talking to themselves because there's no one else to hear them. 43% of the incoming inmates are already diagnosed with serious mental illness, yet ADX Florence has no psychiatric treatment facilities, only isolation cells designed to worsen existing conditions while creating new ones. The facility operates on the theory that human behavior can be controlled through environmental manipulation, that criminals can be broken like wild horses, their spirits crushed until they submit to absolute authority. By the end of the first week, 3 inmates have attempted suicide. By the end of the first month, 17 have been placed on psychiatric medication. By the end of the first year, the facility's medical budget exceeds the operating costs of most county hospitals. The machine is working exactly as designed, It's destroying human minds with industrial efficiency. The mathematics of human destruction reveal themselves in the daily routine of ADX Florence. 22.5 hours of solitary confinement multiplied by 365 days equals 8,212.5 hours per year spent in a concrete box smaller than most people's bathrooms. 8,000 hours of silence. 8,000 hours of staring at concrete walls. 8,000 hours of slow psychological disintegration, measured in taxpayer dollars at $127,000 per soul. Dr. Angela Morrison, the facility's first psychiatrist, documents the progression with clinical precision. Month 1. Inmates pace their cells, counting steps, marking time. Month 3. They begin talking to themselves, creating imaginary companions. Month 6. The conversations stop. They've entered what she terms environmental autism, a state where the mind retreats so deeply into itself that external reality becomes optional. The average ADX inmate speaks fewer than 100 words per month to another human being, less verbal communication than most people have in a single phone conversation. The isolation is so complete that guards report inmates who haven't spoken aloud in over 2 years, their vocal cords atrophying from disuse. Time studies reveal the horrifying precision of the routine. Breakfast delivered through a slot at 5:30 a.m., lunch at 11:15, dinner at 4 p.m., lights out at 9 p.m., then 13 hours of darkness broken only by the hourly flashlight checks. Brief moments when guards shine lights through the cell door slots to verify the inmate is still breathing. 1 hour of recreation means transfer to a concrete exercise yard measuring 12 by 20 feet. No equipment, no human contact. Just concrete walls rising 20 feet on all sides with a small section of sky visible through wire mesh. Inmates call it the dog run. The shower ritual occurs 3 times per week. A 7-minute window of lukewarm water in a concrete stall monitored by closed-circuit cameras. No privacy, no human dignity. Just the basic maintenance required to keep a human body functional while the mind dissolves. Some inmates mark time by counting water drops from leaky faucets. Others memorize the pattern of cracks in concrete walls. The more resourceful create elaborate mental landscapes, building imaginary worlds so detailed they become more real than their concrete reality. But eventually, even imagination dies. Dr. Morrison's notes document the moment when inmates stop creating mental escapes, when they stop fighting the environment and surrender to it, when they become what the system always intended, human-shaped objects that breathe, eat, and excrete, but no longer think, dream, or hope. The machine works with devastating efficiency. It strips away everything that makes someone human while keeping the biological organism alive. A $60 million process for creating living ghosts. The architecture of madness reveals itself in details too precise to be accidental. The acoustic engineering ensures that inmates can hear the mechanical sounds of the facility. Ventilation hums, door locks clicking, toilets flushing on timers, but cannot hear human voices from neighboring cells. Each wall contains 12 inches of reinforced concrete, thick enough to stop a speeding automobile, designed to create perfect acoustic isolation. But the ventilation system creates a constant low-frequency hum that disrupts sleep patterns, a sound just below the threshold of conscious awareness that creates chronic anxiety and disorientation. The lighting system operates on a precise timer that ignores natural circadian rhythms. Fluorescent tubes flicker on at 5 a.m. and shut off at 9 p.m., regardless of season or weather. Inmates lose track of time, of seasons, of the natural world beyond their concrete tomb. The 4-inch window slits are marvels of psychological engineering. Positioned 7 feet above the floor, they require inmates to stand and crane their necks to see anything. The view is angled to show only a small section of sky. Never the horizon, never the mountains, never anything that might provide hope or connection to the world beyond. Temperature control becomes another tool of psychological manipulation. Each cell's heating and cooling system operates independently, controlled from the central command center. Guards can make cells uncomfortably hot or cold without technically violating any regulations, just enough discomfort to prevent rest, not enough to constitute torture in legal terms. The concrete furniture is welded to the floor at precise angles, calculated to prevent comfort. The bed is positioned so inmates cannot see the door while lying down, creating constant anxiety about surprise inspections. The desk is too high for comfortable writing, making communication with the outside world physically uncomfortable. Even the toilet becomes an instrument of control. It flushes on a 15-minute timer controlled by guards who can disable it as punishment for minor infractions. Inmates learn to coordinate their biological needs with the arbitrary mechanical schedule, surrendering one of the most basic human autonomies. Maintenance logs reveal the psychological damage written into the architecture itself. Cell walls require weekly psychological damage assessments to document scratch marks where inmates claw at concrete, head-sized dents where they beat their skulls against walls, and bloodstains that suggest systematic self-harm. The walls themselves become witnesses to human destruction. Each cell tells the story of minds that have shattered against concrete precision. Each scratch mark represents a moment when someone tried to claw their way back to sanity. Each bloodstain marks another victory for the machine. The facility consumes $127,000 per prisoner annually, making each cell more expensive to maintain than most people's homes. But the real cost isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the systematic destruction of human consciousness, one precisely engineered detail at a time. Warden Robert Hood's daily routine begins at 4:30 a.m. in his suburban home 23 miles from ADX Florence. He showers, shaves, and dresses in clothes that will never smell like the facility because the air circulation system ensures that nothing escapes. Not sound, not scent, not hope. Hood drives through mountain darkness toward a job that requires psychological evaluations every 6 months, not to assess his competence, but to monitor his humanity. Because running ADX Florence changes people in ways that federal officials have learned to measure and manage. The administrative machinery operates with military precision. Guards carry no keys because all doors are controlled electronically from a central command bunker buried 100 yards underground. Every human interaction must be logged, timed, and reported in triplicate. The facility generates more paperwork per prisoner than most hospitals produce per patient. Staff training manuals read like psychological warfare textbooks. Guards learn to conduct welfare checks without engaging in conversation, to deliver meals without acknowledging the human receiving them, to treat inmates as environmental hazards rather than people. The dehumanization is systematic, necessary, and devastating to everyone involved. Hood oversees a staff of 350 people managing 421 prisoners, nearly one guard for every inmate. Yet, human contact is forbidden except in medical emergencies. They've created the most heavily staffed isolation facility in human history. The staff hierarchy reflects military structure more than traditional corrections. Officers undergo 6 months of specialized training that includes psychological conditioning techniques, stress inoculation protocols, and what the manual euphemistically calls empathy management procedures. ADX Florence maintains a 340% annual turnover rate among correctional officers, triple the national average for maximum security facilities. Exit interviews consistently cite moral exhaustion as the primary reason for quitting, though most former guards struggle to articulate the precise nature of their distress. Hood's office walls display commendations for operational efficiency, budget management, and security compliance. But they cannot display the true measure of his success, the systematic transformation of coherent human beings into hollow-eyed shells who speak to walls and laugh at nothing. During rare interviews, Hood speaks in the careful language of federal bureaucracy, administrative segregation, environmental manipulation, controlled movement protocols. He never uses words like torture, destruction, or madness, though everyone understands that's what they're discussing. Every night I go home wondering if we're the good guys. Hood confesses during an unguarded moment in 1998. We tell ourselves we're protecting society from dangerous criminals, but sometimes I look at what we've built and I can't tell the difference between us and them. The warden's burden is knowing exactly what the facility does while being required to describe it in language that obscures its true nature. He manages America's most expensive experiment in human destruction while filing reports that make it sound like public service. Hood retires in 2001 after 6 years of service, the maximum recommended assignment for ADX Florence wardens. His replacement undergoes the same psychological evaluation process, the same specialized training, the same gradual transformation from correction officer to administrator of systematic psychological destruction. The machine demands fresh operators because it consumes the humanity of everyone who serves it. The famous ghosts of ADX Florence arrive with fanfare and vanish into concrete silence. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, transferred from a county jail where he spent 2 years fighting extradition. Ramzi Youssef, architect of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, delivered under military escort from a federal courthouse in Manhattan. Each high-profile inmate requires customized containment protocols that cost taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Kaczynski's cell is stripped of all metal objects, no bed frame, no toilet fixtures, no ventilation grates, because psychiatrists fear he might fashion weapons for suicide or assault. Everything is molded concrete or heavy plastic, creating an environment that resembles a padded room disguised as a prison cell. Youssef faces additional communication restrictions beyond the standard ADX protocol. His mail is screened by terrorism experts, his rare phone calls are monitored by Arabic translators, and his cell includes electronic jamming equipment that blocks radio frequencies. The cost of containing him exceeds $150,000 annually, enough to fund college scholarships for 6 students. In 2017, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman arrives amid unprecedented media attention, inadvertently exposing ADX Florence to international scrutiny for the first time in its 22-year history. His intake requires 24-hour surveillance, specialized cell modifications, including ground-penetrating radar, to prevent tunnel digging, and a dedicated team of 12 guards who must undergo psychological evaluation every 30 days. The cost of containing El Chapo approaches $2.3 million annually, more than the entire operating budget of some federal courthouses. Yet he poses zero physical threat to society in his current environment. His legendary escape artistry is meaningless against 12-inch concrete walls and electronic surveillance systems designed by nuclear security specialists. But celebrity status accelerates psychological deterioration rather than providing protection. Guards report that famous inmates decline faster than anonymous ones, as if prior notoriety makes the erasure of identity more devastating. Kaczynski stops writing within 18 months. Youssef requests psychiatric medication after 2 years. El Chapo's lawyers file emergency motions describing rapid cognitive decline within 6 months of arrival. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated several high-profile inmates, notes the tragic irony. These men achieved infamy through their intelligence, their planning ability, their capacity to manipulate complex systems. ADX Florence systematically destroys precisely those cognitive functions that made them dangerous in the first place. The 3 most notorious inmates alone cost taxpayers $381,000 annually to maintain, enough money to fund full-ride scholarships for 15 college students. Yet they contribute nothing to public safety beyond symbolic value. They've become expensive trophies in America's trophy case of perfect control. Their presence transforms ADX Florence from a correctional facility into something resembling a museum of criminal history, where famous monsters are preserved in concrete amber for the satisfaction of a public that demands visible punishment for invisible crimes. But the real criminals, former guards whisper, might be the people who designed this system of systematic human destruction and called it justice. The letters from ADX Florence arrive at post offices across America like dispatches from a dying planet. Families receive envelopes postmarked from Florence, Colorado, containing messages that reveal the gradual linguistic deterioration of isolated minds. Dr. Sarah Chen, a linguistics professor at the University of Colorado, analyzes correspondence patterns as part of a study on isolation's effects on language acquisition and retention. Her findings document a measurable decline in cognitive function that accelerates over time. Year 1. Letters maintain complex sentence structure, sophisticated vocabulary, and coherent narrative flow. Inmates describe their daily routine, express frustration with conditions, and maintain connections to external reality through detailed questions about family events, current news, and shared memories. Year 3. Sentence structure simplifies. Vocabulary shrinks noticeably. Content shifts from external concerns to internal preoccupations. Detailed descriptions of cell dimensions, obsessive focus on meal schedules, repetitive complaints about minor institutional policies. The letters become shorter, less frequent, increasingly disconnected from the recipient's life and interests. Year 5. Handwriting deteriorates. Spelling errors increase. Grammar becomes erratic. Content focuses almost exclusively on immediate physical sensations, temperature, hunger, sleep patterns, as if the writer's consciousness has shrunk to match the dimensions of their concrete environment. The mail censorship process creates additional psychological damage through systematic delay. Every piece of correspondence undergoes 14 different security checks, creating 3-month delays between sending and receiving letters. By the time families respond to questions, the inmate has forgotten asking them. Conversations become impossible. Relationships dissolve into confusion. Chen's vocabulary analysis reveals particularly disturbing trends. The average ADX inmate loses 23% of their active vocabulary after 5 years of isolation. Technical terms disappear first, followed by emotional expressions, then abstract concepts. Their language becomes increasingly concrete, limited to basic survival needs and immediate sensory experience. One letter fragment, written in increasingly deteriorated handwriting, simply repeats the phrase, "I forget what trees look like," 47 times across 3 pages. The repetition suggests obsessive-compulsive symptoms, but also reveals the profound cognitive limitation that isolation creates. The writer can remember that trees exist but cannot access the mental imagery that once allowed him to visualize them. Family members report that late-stage correspondence becomes increasingly difficult to understand, not because of poor handwriting, but because the cognitive organization behind the writing has collapsed. Thoughts jump randomly between subjects. Time references become confused. The letters read like the work of someone suffering from dementia or traumatic brain injury. Dr. Chen's research concludes that extreme isolation doesn't just damage social skills or emotional regulation. It systematically destroys the cognitive architecture that allows human consciousness to function. The letters from ADX Florence are essentially documentation of minds dying while bodies remain alive. The postal workers who handle this correspondence report their own psychological difficulties. "You start to recognize the handwriting," explains Denver Postal Supervisor Maria Santos. "You watch it deteriorate over years. Sometimes I wonder if I'm handling the last coherent thoughts these men will ever have." Thomas Silverstein had survived 28 years in federal custody when he arrived at ADX Florence in 1995. Convicted of murdering a prison guard, he'd spent the previous decade in various forms of solitary confinement, making him uniquely qualified to assess the facility's psychological impact. "This place is different," he wrote to his sister in February 1999. "The other holes were about punishment. This place is about erasure." Silverstein's case file documents the gradual transformation of a violent but coherent criminal into something unrecognizable. A man who had maintained extensive correspondence, filed sophisticated legal appeals, and manipulated prison systems with cunning intelligence slowly dissolving into confused silence. His daily routine becomes obsessively documented in letters that grow shorter and more erratic over 4 years. Morning, count concrete blocks in cell walls, always 127. Afternoon, trace cracks in ceiling. Pattern changes daily, though it doesn't. Evening, listen for sounds that aren't there. Voices calling his name, music from his childhood, conversations between guards that he knows are imaginary. The investigation into his death reveals systematic failures that extend far beyond individual negligence. Guards had not conducted required suicide prevention checks for 6 hours before discovering his body, hanging from a noose constructed of bedsheets. But the autopsy reveals evidence of systematic self-starvation spanning several months, a gradual suicide that no one noticed because observation had become mechanical rather than human. Psychological evaluations had been falsified. Dr. Martin Cole, the psychiatrist responsible for monitoring Silverstein's mental health, had filed reports describing stable mood and adaptive behavior during periods when guards' logs documented the inmate talking to walls, laughing at nothing, and refusing to eat for days at a time. The financial cost of Silverstein's death exceeds $2.3 million in legal settlements, investigations, and policy reviews, more than the annual salary of 47 public school teachers. But the real cost cannot be calculated in dollars. His death forces federal officials to confront the possibility that they've created something that constitutes torture under international law. Silverstein's suicide note, written in increasingly deteriorated handwriting over several weeks, reads like a field report from psychological hell. This place doesn't break your body. It erases your mind. Day by day, memory by memory, until you can't remember who you were before they put you in this concrete coffin. I'm not killing myself. I'm just finishing what this place started. The Bureau of Prisons responds to the crisis by implementing additional suicide prevention protocols, more frequent wellness checks, mandatory psychological evaluations, and enhanced monitoring systems. But these measures cannot address the fundamental problem. ADX Florence is designed to break human spirits. Preventing suicide while maintaining systematic psychological destruction becomes an impossible contradiction. Dr. Chen, the facility psychiatrist, submits her resignation 2 months after Silverstein's death. Her final report to the Bureau of Prisons reads, "We are not running a correctional facility. We are operating a laboratory for studying the systematic destruction of human consciousness. I cannot participate in this experiment any longer." 6 weeks later, Dr. Chen is found dead in her car from apparent suicide, leaving behind a note that reads, "They killed my patients first, then they killed my conscience. I can't live with what we've done." The machine claims another victim, this time one of its operators. Between 2005 and 2007, something unprecedented begins happening at ADX Florence. Something the architects never anticipated, the psychologists never predicted, and the administrators struggle to comprehend. The inmates begin fighting back, not with violence or escape attempts, but through systematic self-destruction that transforms their bodies into weapons against the system designed to break their minds. It begins with small acts of defiance that medical staff initially dismiss as attention-seeking behavior. Inmates cutting themselves with fragments of concrete chipped from cell walls, swallowing improvised objects, pieces of plastic, metal filings, fragments of their own clothing. But the pattern escalates into something far more disturbing: coordinated campaigns of self-mutilation that turn ADX Florence into a battlefield where the war is fought inside human bodies. The creativity of self-harm becomes a grotesque testament to human ingenuity under extreme duress. Inmates learn to create chemical burns by mixing concrete dust with bodily fluids. They develop techniques for systematically destroying their own teeth by grinding them against cell walls. They discover methods for breaking bones that leave no evidence of external force, repeatedly striking the same spot against concrete surfaces until hairline fractures accumulate into complete breaks. Medical intervention logs document the staggering frequency. Emergency treatments average 2 incidents per week, with each intervention costing taxpayers an average of $847. The mathematics of self-destruction reveal that inmates are generating over $140,000 annually in medical costs through deliberate self-harm. But these aren't random acts of desperation. Guards report that the incidents appear coordinated, multiple inmates engaging in similar forms of self-harm within days of each other, as if following an unspoken protocol. The isolation system designed to prevent communication has instead created a new form of silent solidarity, the shared project of forcing the system to confront the human cost of its own cruelty. Dr. Angela Morrison documents the progression with clinical horror. They're not trying to escape, she writes in her private notes. They're trying to make themselves so expensive to maintain that the system will have to acknowledge what it's doing to them. The hunger strikes are the most coordinated form of resistance. 23 inmates simultaneously refuse food for periods exceeding 30 days, forcing expensive medical interventions including forced feeding procedures that cost over $3,000 per incident. The strikes don't demand better conditions or early release. They demand recognition that what's happening at ADX Florence constitutes systematic torture. Warden Patricia Lopez, Hood's replacement, finds herself managing a crisis that has no precedent in American corrections. Her facility has become a laboratory where human beings conduct experiments on their own bodies to prove that the system designed to contain them has become a machine for manufacturing suffering. "We built this place to break the most dangerous criminals in America," she confides to a deputy during an unguarded moment. "Instead, we've created martyrs who use their own bodies to indict our entire approach to justice." The self-mutilation epidemic forces federal officials to confront an impossible paradox: preventing suicide while maintaining a system specifically designed to make life unbearable. They install additional cameras, implement hourly wellness checks, and deploy psychiatric staff trained in suicide prevention. But these measures cannot address the fundamental contradiction at the heart of ADX Florence. They've built a $60 million machine to systematically destroy human consciousness while keeping human bodies alive. The inmates have discovered that destroying their bodies is the only way to indict the destruction of their minds. Dr. Sarah Chen arrives at her congressional testimony on March 15, 2008, carrying 2 briefcases that will transform the national conversation about American corrections. One contains her official psychiatric evaluations, sanitized for public consumption. The other contains the documents she was never supposed to keep: patient files, guard testimonies, and medical records that reveal the true scope of psychological devastation at ADX Florence. Representative Barbara Boxer, chair of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Drugs, opens the hearing with a question that will echo through decades of litigation. Dr. Chen, in your professional opinion, does ADX Florence constitute torture under international law? Chen's answer is immediate and unequivocal. Yes, Congresswoman, what we have created at ADX Florence meets every clinical definition of systematic psychological torture. We have built a machine designed to destroy human consciousness while maintaining the fiction that we are operating a correctional facility. Her testimony reveals the systematic cover-up that has allowed ADX Florence to operate without public scrutiny. Psychological evaluations falsified to hide evidence of institutional psychosis. Suicide statistics suppressed to avoid federal oversight. Medical records altered to conceal the relationship between isolation and mental health crises. Chen presents case studies that read like war crimes documentation. Inmate ADX 347, a bank robber with no prior mental health issues, developed severe auditory hallucinations within 15 months. By year 3, he believes the ventilation system is transmitting messages from deceased family members. By year 5, he has constructed an elaborate delusional system involving government mind control experiments. Inmate ADX 089, convicted of drug trafficking, begins experiencing what psychiatrists term environmentally induced psychosis after 18 months of isolation. He develops the unshakable belief that his cell walls are slowly closing in, forcing him to sleep standing upright against the door. Medical staff document his progressive weight loss and sleep deprivation, but provide no treatment because ADX Florence has no psychiatric facilities. The pattern repeats across 147 documented cases. Individuals with no prior mental illness developing severe psychiatric symptoms that persist years after their eventual release. Chen's research demonstrates that ADX Florence has created a new category of psychological damage that didn't exist in psychiatric literature before the facility opened. "We are not housing dangerous criminals," Chen tells the stunned congressional panel. "We are manufacturing them." Every day of extreme isolation creates cognitive damage that makes these men less capable of functioning in society when they are eventually released. We have built the most expensive crime prevention program in American history, and it creates more criminals than it prevents. The medical files Chen presents reveal the astronomical hidden costs. Psychiatric medications alone cost over $47,000 per inmate annually. Emergency mental health interventions average 8 per month facility-wide. The specialized medical staff required to manage institutionally induced psychosis represents 37% of ADX Florence's total operating budget. Representative John Conyers, ranking minority member, asks the question that exposes the moral heart of the crisis. Dr. Chen, if this facility opened in another country and housed American prisoners under these conditions, would we consider it a human rights violation requiring diplomatic intervention? Chen's response creates a moment of absolute silence in the congressional hearing room. Congressmen, if any other nation operated a facility like ADX Florence and subjected American citizens to these conditions, we would demand international sanctions and consider it grounds for military intervention. Her testimony triggers immediate federal investigations. But Chen knows the bureaucratic response will be limited to cosmetic reforms that preserve the fundamental structure while addressing superficial criticisms. The machine is too expensive to abandon, too symbolically important to acknowledge as a failure. 2 weeks after her congressional testimony, Dr. Sarah Chen is found dead in her car in the parking lot of a suburban shopping mall, apparent suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. Her final note, discovered on the passenger seat, contains a single sentence that indicts the entire American correction system. They killed my patients first, then they killed my conscience. The investigation into her death is perfunctory. No evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, just another casualty of a system that consumes the humanity of everyone who serves it, inmates and administrators alike. The Amnesty International team arrives in Florence, Colorado, in September 2014 like war crimes investigators documenting atrocities in a conflict zone. Their mission: compile the first comprehensive international assessment of conditions at ADX Florence, using standards established by the United Nations Convention Against Torture. Lead investigator Dr. James Rodriguez has documented human rights violations in 17 countries, including military dictatorships and failed states. But his team's findings at ADX Florence will rank among the most disturbing of his career. We have seen systematic torture disguised as criminal justice, he reports to Amnesty's London headquarters. The American government has built the most sophisticated machinery for destroying human consciousness that we have ever documented. The investigation spans 18 months and includes testimony from 23 former guards, 47 released inmates, and 12 medical professionals who worked at the facility. The resulting report, titled Buried Alive: Solitary Confinement in the U.S., runs 437 pages and reads like an indictment of American civilization. The guards' testimonies reveal the systematic training and psychological manipulation that transforms correction officers into administrators of torture. Training manuals explicitly describe techniques for environmental control, including deliberate sleep disruption, temperature manipulation, and the withholding of medical care as behavioral modification tools. Former guard Marcus Williams describes the gradual dehumanization required to function at ADX Florence. They train you to see inmates as environmental hazards, not people. You learn to deliver meals without making eye contact, to conduct welfare checks without acknowledging the human you're observing, to treat human suffering as a necessary component of institutional security. The medical testimonies are even more damning. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who served as staff psychiatrist from 2003 to 2009, describes a systematic policy of denying mental health treatment to inmates showing signs of psychological deterioration. The administration's position was that providing psychiatric care would undermine the deterrent effect of isolation. We were explicitly instructed to document mental health crises without treating them. International law experts recruited for the investigation conclude that ADX Florence's isolation protocols exceed those used by totalitarian regimes that the United States routinely condemns for human rights violations. The facility's conditions are more restrictive than those documented at China's Qingcheng prison, North Korea's Kwanli-So camps, and Iran's Evin prison. The American government has achieved something unprecedented, writes Dr. Helen Morrison, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, in her contribution to the Amnesty Report. They have created a system of systematic psychological destruction that is more comprehensive and sophisticated than anything we have documented in openly authoritarian regimes. The report's publication triggers immediate international condemnation. The European Union issues a formal diplomatic protest. The United Nations Human Rights Council calls for international inspections. 47 countries file formal complaints with the International Criminal Court, demanding investigation of American officials for crimes against humanity. But the domestic American response reveals the political impossibility of meaningful reform. No major media outlets cover the report's publication. Congressional leaders dismiss international criticism as anti-American propaganda. The Bureau of Prisons responds with a 4-page press release defending ADX Florence as a necessary tool for protecting public safety from the most dangerous criminals. The Amnesty investigation's most disturbing finding involves the systematic destruction of evidence. Internal emails, obtained through whistleblower sources, reveal that Bureau of Prisons officials have been preparing for international scrutiny since 2010. Including the systematic destruction of medical records, guard training materials, and inmate correspondence that document the facility's true impact on human consciousness. Dr. Rodriguez concludes his investigation with a warning that proves prophetic. ADX Florence represents more than a single facility. It represents a philosophy of punishment that treats human destruction as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of perfect security. Until America confronts the moral implications of what it has built, this facility will stand as monument to the abandonment of human rights in favor of state power. The $60 million machine continues operating, consuming human minds and taxpayer dollars with equal efficiency, protected by public indifference and political calculation. January 19, 2017. The motorcade carrying Joaquin El Chapo Guzman winds through the Colorado mountains toward ADX Florence under the protection of federal marshals, FBI counterterrorism units, and military contractors typically reserved for protecting nuclear weapons shipments. His arrival transforms ADX Florence from a secret government facility into an international media spectacle. For the first time in the prison's 22-year history, television crews from 17 countries gather outside the facility's gates, inadvertently exposing its operations to global scrutiny. El Chapo's legendary escape artistry, 2 successful breaks from maximum security Mexican prisons, including a mile-long tunnel system requiring months of engineering precision, forces Bureau of Prisons officials to implement unprecedented containment protocols that reveal the true extent of the facility's capabilities. His cell undergoes specialized modifications that cost taxpayers $473,000. Ground-penetrating radar systems installed beneath the floor detect any subterranean activity. Acoustic monitoring equipment sensitive enough to detect conversations whispered in Spanish. Electromagnetic field generators that disrupt any electronic device within a 50-foot radius. 24-hour surveillance requires a dedicated team of 12 guards who must undergo psychological evaluation every 30 days, not for their own protection, but to ensure they don't develop inappropriate emotional attachment to the inmate they're observing. The human cost of perfect surveillance includes the systematic dehumanization of both the watched and the watchers. The annual cost of containing El Chapo approaches $2.3 million, more than the entire operating budget of some federal courthouses. Yet he poses zero physical threat to society in his current environment. His mythic reputation as an escape artist becomes meaningless against 12-inch concrete walls and surveillance systems designed by nuclear security specialists. But celebrity status accelerates rather than mitigates psychological deterioration, International media attention creates additional pressure that transforms El Chapo from a notorious criminal into a living symbol of America's approach to punishment. His treatment at ADX Florence becomes a test case for international human rights law. Within 6 months, his lawyers file explosive court documents claiming that his conditions constitute torture under the UN Convention Against Torture. The legal filings, translated into 14 languages and distributed globally, provide international audiences with their first detailed description of daily life at ADX Florence. Mr. Guzman is subjected to conditions that would be considered torture if imposed by any other nation on American citizens, writes defense attorney Eduardo Balarezo. He spends 22.5 hours daily in a concrete cell, smaller than most Americans' closets, denied meaningful human contact, subjected to constant surveillance that eliminates all privacy, and given access to sunlight for 90 minutes every 3 days. The international legal challenge creates an impossible situation for American officials. El Chapo's global notoriety means that his treatment at ADX Florence becomes a measure of American commitment to human rights, yet providing him with more humane conditions would undermine the facility's deterrent value and trigger demands for similar treatment for all inmates. His case exposes the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American criminal justice. The nation that lectures other countries about human rights operates the most sophisticated system of psychological torture in human history. El Chapo's imprisonment at ADX Florence becomes a symbol of American hypocrisy that undermines diplomatic efforts to promote democracy and human rights internationally. Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto formally protests El Chapo's treatment, creating a diplomatic crisis that forces the State Department to defend conditions that international law experts classify as torture. The situation escalates when the Inter-American Court of Human Rights agrees to hear Mexico's complaint, threatening to create binding international legal precedent that could force the closure of all American supermax facilities. El Chapo's arrival transforms ADX Florence from a domestic policy issue into an international human rights crisis. For the first time in its history, the facility faces scrutiny that cannot be managed through bureaucratic obfuscation or media silence. The $60 million machine designed to operate in secrecy finds itself exposed to global condemnation, its methods debated in international courts, its moral legitimacy challenged by the same democratic values it claims to protect. The legal avalanche begins in the summer of 2017, when civil rights organizations recognize that El Chapo's high-profile case has created an unprecedented opportunity to challenge the entire supermax system. Within 18 months, 23 separate lawsuits converge on federal courts, creating the largest prison rights case in American legal history. The American Civil Liberties Union, the Center for Constitutional Rights, and Amnesty International coordinate a legal strategy that treats ADX Florence not as an isolated facility, but as the flagship of a nationwide system of psychological torture disguised as criminal justice. Their coordinated filing strategy overwhelms the Bureau of Prisons' legal department, forcing officials to defend practices they have never had to justify in open court. Lead attorney Sarah Martinez frames the central legal question with devastating simplicity. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. ADX Florence systematically destroys human consciousness through environmental manipulation. If psychological torture is not cruel and unusual punishment, then the Constitution's protection of human dignity has no meaning. The legal discovery process forces the government to release thousands of previously classified documents, including guard training manuals that explicitly describe techniques for psychological conditioning of inmates. Internal memos reveal that federal officials have always understood the facility's true purpose, using clinical language to obscure systematic human rights violations. A 1998 Bureau of Prisons training manual, obtained through discovery, instructs guards in environmental manipulation techniques, including strategic use of temperature variation, calculated interruption of sleep cycles, and systematic denial of sensory stimulation. The document reads like a psychological warfare textbook rather than correctional guidance. The financial costs of legal defense reveal another hidden expense of the ADX Florence system. By 2019, the federal government has spent $14.7 million on legal fees defending the facility, enough money to fund mental health treatment for 1,200 military veterans, yet the lawsuits continue multiplying. Dr. Craig Haney, a Stanford University psychologist specializing in solitary confinement, provides expert testimony that exposes the systematic nature of psychological destruction at ADX Florence. His research, conducted over 2 years with access to former inmates, documents measurable cognitive damage that persists years after release. The human brain requires social interaction, sensory stimulation, and environmental variety to maintain normal function, Haney testifies. ADX Florence systematically eliminates all three, creating conditions that inevitably produce psychological deterioration. This is not an unfortunate side effect of security measures. It is the intended result of systematic psychological torture. The government's defense strategy reveals the moral bankruptcy of the entire system. Rather than denying that ADX Florence causes psychological damage, federal attorneys argue that such damage is legally acceptable because the inmates deserve to suffer for their crimes. They essentially argue that the Constitution's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment doesn't apply to people the government deems sufficiently dangerous. Federal Judge Sarah Martinez, randomly assigned to oversee the consolidated cases, becomes the first judicial officer to examine ADX Florence's operations without bureaucratic filtering. Her initial review of the evidence produces a preliminary ruling that sends shockwaves through the federal correction system. The court finds probable cause to believe that conditions at ADX Florence violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. The systematic isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation documented in this case appear to constitute torture under both domestic and international law. The ruling triggers immediate appeals, but also creates legal precedent that threatens the entire supermax system. If one federal judge can declare ADX Florence unconstitutional, similar rulings could cascade through courts nationwide, potentially forcing the closure of 44 supermax facilities housing over 80,000 Americans. The Bureau of Prisons responds with a desperate legal strategy, arguing that national security requires conditions that would otherwise violate constitutional rights. They essentially claim that terrorism and organized crime have created threats so severe that traditional human rights protections must be suspended. This argument forces federal courts to confront a fundamental question about American democracy. Are there circumstances under which systematic psychological torture becomes acceptable? The answer will determine whether the United States remains committed to human rights or abandons them in favor of unlimited state power disguised as public safety. The lawsuits create a cascade effect that no one anticipated. International human rights organizations begin filing amicus briefs in federal court, creating the unprecedented situation where foreign governments are intervening in American legal proceedings to protect human rights. The moral authority that America has claimed in international affairs collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Federal Judge Sarah Martinez's surprise inspection of ADX Florence on November 15, 2018, occurs with only 48 hours advance notice, preventing the systematic evidence destruction that usually precedes official visits. Her unannounced tour exposes the facility's operations without bureaucratic sanitization for the first time in its 23-year history. Martinez arrives with a court stenographer, 2 federal marshals, and Dr. Craig Haney as an expert witness. Warden Lisa Patterson, caught completely off guard, has no choice but to provide access to areas that have never been seen by independent observers. The tour lasts 7 hours and produces testimony that will reshape American corrections law. The judge's first observation involves the sound. The facility operates in near-complete silence, broken only by mechanical noises, ventilation systems, electronic locks, and the periodic sound of inmates talking to themselves. It is immediately apparent that this environment has been designed to eliminate normal human interaction. Walking through the administrative segregation unit, Martinez documents conditions with legal precision. Cells measure exactly 7 feet by 12 feet, containing 84 square feet of living space, smaller than many Americans' bathrooms. Each cell contains a concrete bed, concrete desk, concrete stool, and a toilet that operates on a timer controlled by guards. The judge observes inmates during the brief periods when cell doors open for meal delivery. Several inmates appear to be suffering from obvious psychological distress. One individual has covered his cell walls with what appears to be excrement. Another lies motionless on his concrete bed during what should be his waking hours. A third paces continuously in a space so small that he can only take 3 steps before turning. Dr. Haney's concurrent observations document the systematic nature of psychological destruction. The facility operates on principles derived from psychological research on sensory deprivation and social isolation. Every aspect of the environment appears designed to maximize psychological stress while maintaining technical compliance with minimum legal standards. Martinez's most damning observations involve the staff. Correctional officers display behavior consistent with persons working in extremely stressful environments. Several guards appear to demonstrate what military psychiatrists term the 1,000-yard stare, a dissociative response to prolonged exposure to human suffering. The judge interviews 3 inmates during the inspection, conversations that reveal the facility's impact on human consciousness. Inmate ADX 234, a former bank robber serving his 8th year in isolation, demonstrates obvious cognitive impairment. He cannot maintain focus during conversation, repeatedly loses his train of thought, and displays hand tremors consistent with neurological damage. Inmate ADX 156, convicted of terrorism-related charges, has developed elaborate delusional systems. He believes that government agents are transmitting electronic signals through the ventilation system to control his thoughts. While this appears to be paranoid delusion, his detailed descriptions of electronic surveillance systems suggest that the facility's extensive monitoring has contributed to his psychological deterioration. The most disturbing interview involves inmate ADX 089, who has stopped speaking altogether. Despite extensive questioning, this individual remains completely silent. Guards report that he has not spoken aloud in over 18 months. Medical records indicate no physical impairment that would prevent speech, suggesting that extreme isolation has resulted in selective mutism or catatonic withdrawal. Martinez's inspection reveals maintenance records that document the physical evidence of psychological destruction, weekly psychological damage assessments that catalog scratch marks on walls, head-shaped dents in concrete surfaces, and bloodstains that suggest systematic self-harm. The facility requires industrial-grade cleaning supplies to remove biological evidence of human suffering. Her 47-page judicial ruling, published 6 months after the inspection, concludes with language that indicts the entire American approach to criminal justice. Having observed the conditions at ADX Florence firsthand, this court finds that the facility operates as a machine designed to systematically destroy human consciousness while maintaining the fiction of constitutional compliance. The isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation documented during inspection meet every clinical and legal definition of torture under both domestic and international law. Martinez orders immediate reforms, including a maximum of 15 years in isolation per inmate, mandatory mental health treatment, and regular judicial oversight. But the Bureau of Prisons files an emergency appeal within hours, delaying implementation while the case proceeds through higher courts. The ruling's publication triggers congressional hearings, international condemnation, and renewed litigation challenging supermax facilities nationwide. But leaked emails reveal that federal officials are not planning reform, they are planning expansion. The $60 million machine has become too symbolically important to abandon, too politically valuable to reform, and too morally compromised to defend. It continues operating in the legal twilight between American ideals and American practice, consuming human minds while bureaucrats debate constitutional interpretation. Judge Martinez's inspection report concludes with a question that no American official has yet attempted to answer. If this facility operated in any other nation and subjected American citizens to these conditions, would we not consider it grounds for international intervention? How do we justify doing to our own citizens what we would never tolerate being done to us? ACT-4, The Legacy, March 15, 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic provides the Bureau of Prisons with perfect cover to implement the most restrictive isolation protocols in ADX Florence's 25-year history. Under the guise of public health protection, they eliminate the last vestiges of human contact that had survived decades of legal challenges and international condemnation. Warden Patricia Stevens announces the enhanced security protocols in a memo that reads like a declaration of war against human consciousness. Effective immediately, all visitation is suspended indefinitely. Recreation periods are eliminated. Educational programs are canceled. Inmates will remain in their cells 24 hours per day until further notice. The pandemic lockdown represents the perfect realization of ADX Florence's founding philosophy: complete human isolation disguised as necessary public health measures. For the first time in the facility's history, inmates experienced total sensory deprivation without the minimal contact previously required by federal regulations. Medical records reveal the devastating irony: 0 cases of COVID-19 occur at ADX Florence during the entire 14-month lockdown period. The facility's isolation systems are so complete that viral transmission becomes impossible. Yet the lockdown continues longer than any other federal facility, suggesting punitive rather than medical motivations. Dr. Angela Foster, the facility's chief medical officer, documents the accelerated psychological deterioration in confidential reports that won't be released until years later. The complete elimination of human contact has produced immediate and severe psychiatric symptoms in previously stable inmates. We are witnessing the systematic breakdown of human consciousness in real time. Suicide attempts increase by 470% during the pandemic lockdown. Self-mutilation incidents occur daily. The facility's psychiatric medication budget triples as staff struggle to manage what amounts to a mass psychological breakdown orchestrated under cover of public health emergency. Leaked audio recordings from this period capture the sound of men screaming for hours in their concrete cells, their voices echoing through empty corridors where guards are forbidden from responding unless there's immediate threat to life. The recordings, later obtained by investigative journalists, provide documentary evidence of systematic psychological torture occurring under the supervision of federal officials. The pandemic lockdown cost taxpayers an additional $12.7 million in emergency psychiatric care, specialized medical equipment, and overtime for staff managing the crisis. Each inmate's annual containment cost rises to $159,000, more than most Americans earn in 2 years, making ADX Florence the most expensive human storage facility in world history. Former guard Marcus Williams breaks his non-disclosure agreement during this period, providing testimony to congressional investigators about the psychological impact on staff. The pandemic gave management an excuse to implement conditions that we all knew were torture. Watching men lose their minds in real time while being forbidden from providing basic human compassion destroyed something in all of us. Williams reveals that correctional officers began experiencing symptoms of secondary trauma, insomnia, anxiety attacks, and what military psychiatrists call moral injury, the psychological damage caused by participating in actions that violate fundamental human values. The lockdown finally ends in May 2021, not because of improved health conditions, but because a federal judge threatens to hold the warden in contempt for implementing conditions that exceed even the extreme isolation normally imposed at this facility. But the damage has been done. 14 months of total isolation have created a generation of inmates whose psychological deterioration exceeds anything previously documented at the facility. International human rights organizations declare the pandemic lockdown a crime against humanity, calling for prosecution of American officials under the Convention Against Torture. But domestic political support for ADX Florence remains unchanged. Public indifference to prisoner suffering provides political cover for practices that would trigger international intervention if implemented by any other government. The pandemic revealed the true scope of American commitment to systematic psychological torture. When given the opportunity to implement total isolation without legal oversight, federal officials embraced it eagerly and maintained it long after any medical justification had disappeared. The machine had evolved beyond its original design, becoming something more efficient and more devastating than its creators ever imagined, a system for destroying human consciousness that operates with the efficiency of industrial production and the moral authority of public health policy. Marcus Williams sits in his truck outside a Denver VA hospital, hands shaking as he records testimony that will violate his federal non-disclosure agreement and potentially expose him to criminal prosecution. After 12 years working at ADX Florence, he can no longer maintain the silence that protects America's most expensive experiment in systematic psychological torture. People need to understand what that place does to everyone who works there, Williams begins, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who has witnessed too much human suffering. We went there thinking we were protecting society from dangerous criminals. We left knowing we had become the dangerous ones. Williams's testimony reveals the systematic dehumanization required to function at ADX Florence, a process that begins during the 6-month training program. New guards undergo empathy management procedures designed to eliminate emotional responses to human suffering. They learn to view inmates as environmental hazards rather than people, to treat human distress as acceptable background noise in the pursuit of institutional security. They train you to deliver meals without making eye contact, Williams explains, to conduct welfare checks without acknowledging the human you're observing, to file reports about suicide attempts or self-mutilation with the same emotional detachment you'd use to document a broken toilet. The psychological impact on staff creates a cascade of personal destruction that extends far beyond the facility's walls. Williams reveals that ADX Florence guards have a 47% higher divorce rate than the general population, 23% higher rates of domestic violence, and suicide rates that exceed combat veterans who served in active war zones. We were destroying human beings 8 hours a day, then going home to our families and pretending to be normal, Williams continues. But you can't compartmentalize that kind of moral damage. It follows you home. It infects every relationship you have. It changes you into something you don't recognize. Internal studies, leaked through Williams and corroborated by other whistleblowers, document the epidemic of psychological problems among ADX Florence staff. Alcoholism rates exceed 80% among guards who serve more than 2 years. Prescription medication abuse, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, sleep aids, becomes standard coping mechanism for dealing with what employees privately call the job that destroys souls. Williams describes the gradual process by which normal people become administrators of systematic torture. You start by following orders, conducting the welfare checks, delivering the meals, filing the reports. But slowly, day by day, you realize that you're participating in something that violates everything you believed about human decency. The breaking point for many guards comes when they witness inmates in advanced stages of psychological deterioration, men who have lost the ability to speak coherently, who smear excrement on walls, who laugh at nothing for hours at a time. You realize that this isn't accident or unfortunate side effect, Williams explains. This is the intended result. The system is working exactly as designed. Williams reveals that many guards develop elaborate psychological defense mechanisms to cope with their role in systematic human destruction. Some convince themselves that inmates deserve whatever suffering they experience. Others adopt a clinical detachment that treats human psychological breakdown as interesting data rather than moral catastrophe. The worst part is the silence, Williams concludes. Everyone knows what we're doing is wrong. Guards, administrators, medical staff, even the warden. But we all maintain this fiction that we're running a correctional facility instead of a torture center because admitting the truth would require us to face what we've become. Williams's revelations trigger congressional investigations media attention, and renewed litigation challenging ADX Florence's operations, but they also expose the political impossibility of meaningful reform. The facility has become too symbolically important to American identity to be abandoned, too invested with taxpayer money to be declared a failure. His testimony ends with a warning that proves prophetic. ADX Florence doesn't just destroy the men locked inside it, it destroys everyone who serves it: guards, administrators, medical staff, even the families of everyone involved. We built a machine that consumes human souls, and now it's consuming the souls of the people who operate it. 6 months after his testimony, Marcus Williams is found dead in his home from apparent suicide, joining the growing list of people whose lives have been destroyed by America's $60 million experiment in systematic psychological torture. The Supermax epidemic spreads across America like a contagion of cruelty, with ADX Florence serving as the prototype for a nationwide system of psychological torture disguised as criminal justice reform. Between 1995 and 2023, 44 similar facilities open across 37 states, creating the largest population of isolated humans in world history. State corrections departments embrace the ADX Florence model with religious fervor, seeing extreme isolation as the ultimate solution to prison violence, gang activity, and administrative challenges. What they create instead is a parallel system of systematic human destruction that operates beyond public scrutiny and constitutional oversight. The numbers reveal the staggering scope of American commitment to psychological torture. Over 80,000 Americans currently live in conditions similar to ADX Florence, experiencing 22 hours or more of daily isolation in cells designed to break human spirits through environmental manipulation. The combined population of Supermax facilities exceeds the entire prison populations of most European nations. California leads the expansion with Pelican Bay State Prison, a $400 million facility that houses 500 inmates in isolation conditions that exceed ADX Florence's restrictions. Texas follows with administrative segregation facilities that confine over 8,000 men and women in isolation cells. New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Ohio each operate multiple Supermax facilities that collectively house tens of thousands of Americans in conditions that international law classifies as torture. The financial costs of the Supermax epidemic exceed all projections. The combined annual operating expenses approach $2.1 billion, enough money to fully fund college education for 84,000 students. Yet research consistently demonstrates that Supermax facilities fail to improve institutional safety, reduce recidivism, or enhance public security. Dr. Stuart Gracian, a Harvard psychiatrist who has studied solitary confinement for 3 decades, documents the systematic nature of psychological destruction across the Supermax system. We have created a nationwide network of facilities designed to produce severe mental illness through environmental manipulation. This represents the largest experiment in systematic psychological torture ever conducted by a democratic government. The recidivism data exposes the fundamental failure of the Supermax model. Inmates released from extreme isolation have higher rates of reoffending than general population prisoners. Psychological damage inflicted during Supermax confinement makes successful reintegration nearly impossible, creating a cycle where torture produces the criminal behavior it claims to prevent. International human rights organizations declare the American Supermax system a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the Convention Against Torture. 47 countries file formal complaints with international courts demanding investigations of American officials for crimes against humanity. The European Union issues travel advisories warning citizens that arrest in America could result in subjection to conditions classified as torture under international law. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights rules that Supermax confinement violates fundamental human rights, though the United States ignores the ruling and continues expanding the system. The philosophical implications extend beyond criminal justice policy. America has created a system where systematic psychological destruction operates as normal government function, where torture has been institutionalized, bureaucratized, and funded through democratic processes. The supermax epidemic represents the normalization of cruelty as public policy. State corrections officials defend the system using language that obscures its true nature. Administrative segregation, restricted housing units, security housing units. But the euphemisms cannot disguise the fundamental reality. America operates the most comprehensive system of psychological torture in human history, subjecting its own citizens to conditions that would trigger international intervention if implemented by any other government. The supermax facilities become monuments to the abandonment of human rights in favor of unlimited state power. They represent the transformation of American democracy into something unrecognizable, a system where systematic cruelty operates as normal government function, where constitutional protections become meaningless when applied to people the state deems unworthy of human consideration. The contagion spreads beyond corrections into immigration detention, military facilities, and juvenile justice systems. The philosophy pioneered at ADX Florence, that human destruction is acceptable when disguised as security measures, infects every aspect of American institutional life. What began as a $60 million solution to prison security problems has evolved into a $2 billion system for manufacturing psychological damage on an industrial scale, protected by public indifference and political calculation. Dr. Reginald Hayes publishes his groundbreaking neurological research in the Journal of Forensic Psychiatry in March 2023, providing the first comprehensive brain imaging analysis of former ADX Florence inmates. His findings transform the legal and medical understanding of extreme isolation, revealing that supermax confinement creates permanent neurological damage equivalent to traumatic brain injury. Hayes's study, conducted over 4 years with funding from the National Institute of Mental Health, uses advanced MRI technology to examine brain structure in 43 men who served between 3 and 15 years at ADX Florence. The results document systematic destruction of neural pathways that control memory, emotional regulation, and social cognition. What we discovered was not surprising, but the extent of damage was devastating, Hayes explains in congressional testimony. Extreme isolation literally shrinks the human brain. The hippocampus, responsible for memory formation, shows an average reduction of 23%. The prefrontal cortex, which controls executive function and decision-making, demonstrates structural abnormalities consistent with severe traumatic brain injury. The neurological damage persists years after release from isolation. Brain scans conducted on subjects who had been free from ADX Florence for up to 7 years show continued abnormalities in neural structure and function. The damage appears to be permanent, suggesting that extreme isolation creates irreversible changes in brain architecture. Most disturbing, the research demonstrates that psychological torture produces measurable physical damage to human consciousness itself. We can see the destruction of personality, memory, and cognition in brain imaging, Hayes continues. Extreme isolation doesn't just cause mental illness, it physically alters the organ that creates human consciousness. The cognitive testing results provide additional evidence of systematic brain damage. 73% of former ADX Florence inmates demonstrate significant impairment in memory formation, problem-solving abilities, and social cognition. Many cannot form new memories effectively, suggesting that isolation has damaged their capacity for learning and adaptation. Language processing shows particular deterioration. Brain imaging reveals damaged connections in areas responsible for speech production and comprehension. Many subjects struggle to maintain conversations, process complex sentences, or access vocabulary they possessed before isolation. The systematic linguistic decline documented in prison letters correlates directly with observable brain damage. Perhaps most tragically, the research reveals damage to neural pathways responsible for human empathy and social connection. These men have lost not just the ability to function in society, Hayes explains, but the neurological capacity to form meaningful human relationships. We have literally destroyed the parts of their brains that allow them to connect with other people. The financial implications of the neurological research are staggering. 73% of inmates released from ADX Florence require immediate transfer to psychiatric facilities, creating additional costs that exceed the original containment expenses. The lifetime medical care required to manage supermax-induced brain damage could exceed $50 billion over the next 3 decades. Hayes's research triggers demands for criminal prosecution of Bureau of Prisons officials under federal laws prohibiting torture and assault. International medical organizations declare that continuing to operate supermax facilities with knowledge of their neurological effects constitutes a crime against humanity. We now have scientific proof that extreme isolation systematically destroys human consciousness, Hayes concludes in his congressional testimony. Continuing to operate these facilities with knowledge of their effects makes every administrator, every guard, and every official complicit in systematic torture designed to cause permanent brain damage. The neurological research provides definitive medical evidence that America has built a system specifically designed to destroy human consciousness while maintaining the fiction of constitutional compliance. The $60 million experiment has achieved something unprecedented in human history: the systematic scientific destruction of the human mind disguised as criminal justice policy. But scientific evidence proves insufficient to challenge political investments in systematic cruelty. Despite documentation of permanent brain damage, despite international condemnation, despite the astronomical financial costs, ADX Florence continues operating at 89% capacity, consuming human minds and taxpayer dollars with industrial efficiency. The machine designed to break human spirits has evolved beyond its creator's intentions, becoming something more precise and devastating, a factory for manufacturing permanent neurological damage that operates with the efficiency of industrial production and the moral authority of democratic government. The final audit arrives on congressional desks in September 2023, like an indictment of American civilization. ADX Florence has consumed $2.7 billion taxpayer dollars since 1995, making it the most expensive correctional experiment in human history, while demonstrably failing to improve public safety, reduce crime, or achieve any measurable benefit to society. The Congressional Budget Office analysis requested by the House Judiciary Committee traces every dollar spent on the facility from initial construction through current operations. The numbers reveal a financial catastrophe disguised as criminal justice policy: $60 million in construction costs, $2.6 billion in operating expenses, and an additional $47 million in legal fees defending practices that international courts classify as torture. Economist Dr. Sarah Chen calculates the opportunity costs with devastating precision. The same money could have funded 108,000 full-ride college scholarships, 13,500 affordable housing units, or comprehensive drug treatment for 270,000 addicted Americans. Instead, we built a machine to systematically destroy human consciousness. The per-inmate costs expose the astronomical expense of systematic psychological torture: $127,000 annually per prisoner, escalating to over $200,000 when medical care for institutionally induced mental illness is included. Each ADX Florence cell costs more to maintain annually than most Americans earn in 2 years. The effectiveness analysis reveals complete failure across every measurable outcome. Of the 742 inmates who have served time at ADX Florence, 97.3% will never be released, making the facility essentially a $2.7 billion tomb for the living dead. The few who are released demonstrate higher recidivism rates than general population prisoners, suggesting that systematic psychological destruction creates rather than prevents criminal behavior. The hidden costs multiply exponentially beyond the facility's official budget. Emergency psychiatric care for former inmates costs taxpayers an additional $37 million annually. Legal challenges to supermax conditions have generated over $200 million in federal court costs. The medical treatment required for guards suffering from secondary trauma adds another $43 million in veterans' health care expenses. The international relations costs cannot be calculated in dollars, but may exceed the financial expenses. America's operation of systematic torture facilities has undermined diplomatic efforts to promote democracy and human rights globally. 47 countries cite American supermax facilities when rejecting U.S. criticism of their own human rights records. Congressional Budget Committee members privately acknowledge what they cannot say publicly. ADX Florence represents the single greatest waste of taxpayer money in the history of American corrections. The facility has consumed enough resources to fund major infrastructure projects while producing no measurable benefit to public safety or crime prevention. Representative Jamie Raskin, the ranking minority member of the House Oversight Committee, frames the fundamental question. We have spent nearly $3 billion to systematically torture 700 Americans while calling it criminal justice. How do we explain this expenditure to taxpayers who need health care, education, and housing? But political calculation trumps fiscal responsibility. No elected official will vote to close ADX Florence despite overwhelming evidence of its failure, because criminal justice policy operates on symbolic rather than practical considerations. The facility has become too important as a symbol of American toughness to be abandoned for mere financial or moral reasons. The audit concludes with projections that reveal the true scope of American commitment to systematic psychological torture. Maintaining current operations through 2050 will cost an additional $4.2 billion, assuming no expansion or inflation adjustments. The total lifetime cost of the ADX Florence experiment will approach $7 billion by mid-century. $7 billion to destroy human consciousness. $7 billion to operate a system that fails every test of effectiveness, constitutionality, and fiscal responsibility. $7 billion to build and maintain a monument to the abandonment of human rights in favor of unlimited state power. The financial audit provides definitive proof that America has prioritized symbolic cruelty over practical solutions, choosing to spend billions destroying human minds rather than addressing the social conditions that create crime. The numbers reveal a democracy that has lost its way, substituting systematic torture for justice while calling it progress. Today, December 24, 2025, ADX Florence continues operating at 89% capacity, housing 421 inmates in conditions that human rights organizations worldwide condemn as systematic torture, while congressional appropriations committees quietly approve funding for expansion projects that will increase the facility's capacity by 15% over the next 3 years. The morning routine remains unchanged from the facility's opening day 30 years ago. Breakfast delivered through slots at 5:30 a.m., followed by 22.5 hours of isolation in concrete cells smaller than parking spaces. The mathematical precision of human destruction continues with industrial efficiency, consuming $159,000 per prisoner annually while producing measurable neurological damage that persists decades after release. Current Warden Lisa Rodriguez oversees the most expensive human storage facility in world history with the bureaucratic efficiency that has characterized the facility since 1995. Her staff of 412 employees manages the systematic psychological destruction of men whose crimes occurred decades ago, whose dangerousness exists primarily in theoretical projections rather than current reality. The facility has become a dark tourism destination for criminology students, international journalists, and human rights investigators seeking to understand American approaches to punishment. Public tours remain strictly forbidden, but aerial photography reveals new construction projects that suggest expansion rather than reform. International condemnation continues mounting as more countries file formal complaints with the International Criminal Court, demanding prosecution of American officials for crimes against humanity. The European Union maintains diplomatic sanctions related to American torture facilities. The United Nations Human Rights Council has voted 17 times to condemn supermax confinement as systematic torture. But domestic American support for ADX Florence remains politically unshakable. Public opinion polls consistently show majority approval for maximum security facilities for dangerous criminals, with most respondents unaware of the specific conditions or costs involved. Political candidates compete to demonstrate toughness on crime by supporting expanded supermax construction. The neurological research has now documented permanent brain damage in over 300 former inmates, creating a generation of Americans whose minds have been systematically destroyed by their own government. The medical costs of caring for supermax-induced neurological damage will burden taxpayers for decades, yet no official acknowledges the connection between institutional torture and subsequent medical expenses. New inmates continue arriving via armored convoy, beginning their descent into systematic psychological destruction that will consume hundreds of thousands of taxpayer dollars, while producing no measurable benefit to public safety. The machine operates with the mechanical precision of industrial production, processing human consciousness into neurological damage with clinical efficiency. The legal challenges continue through federal courts, but judicial precedent favors institutional security over human rights. Judges who tour the facility acknowledge its constitutional problems, while ruling that public safety requires acceptance of systematic torture as necessary evil. The law adapts to accommodate practices it was designed to prevent. In the surrounding Colorado landscape, life continues with stunning indifference to the systematic human destruction occurring behind concrete walls. Families drive past the facility on Highway 67 without understanding that they are witnessing the most expensive experiment in psychological torture ever conducted by a democratic government. The final shot is aerial footage of ADX Florence at sunset, its concrete walls casting long shadows across the pristine mountain valley. The shadows stretch across miles of wilderness, reaching toward communities that benefit from the facility's economic impact while remaining willfully ignorant of its human cost. The facility stands as a perfect metaphor for American justice in the 21st century, a $60 million monument to the discovery that systematic cruelty can be institutionalized, bureaucratized, and funded through democratic processes, a machine that destroys human consciousness while claiming to protect human safety, a testament to the infinite capacity of human beings to inflict suffering on other human beings while convincing themselves that such suffering serves a greater good. In our attempt to create the perfect prison, we have revealed something fundamental about ourselves, that given sufficient bureaucratic structure, adequate funding, and appropriate legal justification, Americans will systematically torture their own citizens while calling it justice. The question that echoes in silence across the Colorado mountains remains unanswered. In building this machine to break human spirits, what have we made of our own souls?